This is a conversation with Jayati Ghosh. She is an economist, former professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, and currently a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. In this conversation, we discuss the purpose of economics, the problems of capitalism, the problems with USAID, and how aid is used as imperialism. We also cover what causes a debt crisis in developing countries, and then we talk about demonetization in India and feminist economics. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars in Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and efforts. If you'd like to see it continue, please consider making a donation on Patreon or Anchor. You can join as a member on YouTube, and members get early access to these videos. You can leave a gift on Instagram Reels, or you can also buy super thanks on YouTube. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments. All forms of engagement, they really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And mitron, now it's no time. In the book Perilous Passage, Amya Kumar Bagchi asked the question, how do we decide the criteria by which the condition of people should be judged? A first answer would be that people should be able to live a good life. A good life, according to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or Karl Marx or Frederick Engels or Rabindranath Tagore, can be lived only by a free person living among other free human beings. They can, however, live freely only if they have access to such basic material like food, clothing, shelter, peace, and community. Why are we interested in measuring the rate of economic growth? Finding out why it accelerates or falls. The only purpose that is likely to elicit near universal agreement is the use of the goods for the good of human beings. And then I'm going to add the conclusion, so that for the ability to live a good life. I would love to get your take on the purpose of economics as well. Why is it important to be interested in these criteria and metrics that Mr. Bakshi has listed out? What is economics and what purpose does it serve according to you?
I'm so glad you started with Omyo Bakchi's description of why we do economics, because I think that's why many of us actually do economics. But that is not the reason economics is done largely today, or at least if it is, it has gone so far away from that motivation that we really have to drag it back somehow. And yes, that is certainly why I do economics. And that's why it's important, because the whole idea of economics is to somehow assist in human progress and to make sure that human capabilities are developed in as best a possible way, and to ensure that economic activities do not involve so much inequality that they do not enable people to live up to their full capabilities or give them the basic freedoms that they deserve and which are their rights. So that's why many of us do economics. But when you think about what the economics discipline now basically focuses on, it's really, if you like, it's become the idea of economic expansion for its own sake. It is growth of GDP, growth of the economy is seen as the goal. It's the ideology of the cancer cell. It's not looking at anything beyond expansion. And that expansion is defined in a very limited way in terms of the marketed transactions that make up the national income, rather than the quality of life, all of the other things that you mentioned right now. So really, when I think of why we have to do economics today, I would say the reason we have to do economics is to rescue it from mainstream economics. We have to study it because it's too important to be left to economists. We have to actually bring back the essential aim of an economy, which is to serve society, to serve people in harmony with nature and the planet. Instead of that, we've gone completely the other way. We are trying to make people, the planet, nature, serve the economy. And so really, we need to study economics because it's too important. It determines everything. It is deeply political, even when it's presented as not political, as technical and technocratic. It's deeply political. It's deeply about distribution and power. And therefore, more and more people need to know enough about it to contest a lot of the things that we're generally told.
The English economist Alfred Marshall used to keep a picture of a poor worker on his desk to constantly remind him of the purpose of economics. Maybe one way to rescue economics is to also put a picture for every economist's desk as well. You have broadly defined yourself as a Marxian post-Keynesian economist, and you've said in the past that you don't hold these positions in a rigid doctrinal sense. You're also a socialist feminist economist. You've been influenced by the works of Michał Kalecki as well. Let's define all these terms. If you can just provide a quick summary on your economic stance and policies, what are the Cliff's Notes? How should the economy work?
Wow. Okay. So, I'm increasingly resistant to a lot of the labels because, if you say you're a Marxist, then they say, oh, well, do you believe that the labor theory of value holds and then prove that it does in the modern capitalist society? Or if you say, you're a feminist, you say, well, what does that mean for the economy? Broadly, I think my basic philosophy, my basic approach to the economy and understanding it, the goal is to make sure that people's life chances do not determine their lived outcomes, either materially or socially or politically. That is the accident of where you are born, who you are born as, where in which class of society you are born, in which occupation your parents are, etc. All of that would not be the basic determinants of your life chances as they are currently. But instead, that we would have an economic system that strives to make every person in the society develop to the best of his or her own capabilities. And that's my goal in studying economics. Do I feel that that corresponds to a particular approach? Yes, it's a broadly socialist, feminist, humanist understanding of the economy. I also believe in the very great importance of power in determining economic outcomes. And the various streams that you've mentioned, the Marxian, the socialist, the feminist, they're all very aware of the importance of power. And I think that's another reason why I'm much more in sympathy with these approaches. They also provide a perspective which goes beyond a very simplistic understanding that markets will deliver optimal outcomes. I critique the notion of optimality, which is a very male-centric, utilitarian, possessive, individualist notion of optimality. I critique the idea that markets deliver that, even in its own terms, but I also critique the idea that that is the goal of human existence.
One economic system you're not a big fan of is capitalism, and two of your big influences in life as well, John Maynard Keynes and Michał Kalecki, you're also not the biggest fans of capitalism. In the book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, Keynes argued that capitalism can be unstable, requires government intervention. Kalecki's criticisms were centered more on the class conflict and full employment. And these are just few of the problems associated with capitalism. So let's zoom right in, let's break it down. What are the big problems with capitalism?
The basic problem with capitalism, of course, is that it distributes the means of production in such a way that it's highly unequal and generates power. Okay, so there are people who own capital and are therefore enabled to determine what everybody else who doesn't own capital does. Now, this is a very simplified and, if you like, basic level of putting it, because there are many layers to this, right? There can be workers who manage to save up and own a share or two in some company, or pension funds that actually are also involved in owning capital. That's not quite the same thing. Essentially, it is the idea that there are people who will have to work for a living, and there are people who have assets that will generate for them incomes. The people who have the assets are the ones who determine how the economy is run, whether the other people get employment or not, the terms on which they get employment, the kind of other labor that they are forced to perform, often unpaid, especially among women, and so on. So it is really the fact that capitalism generates a power relationship that is deeply unjust, but is also, frankly, increasingly evidently inefficient. Inefficient in terms of what was the whole idea of capitalism, that it was dynamic, that it would give you innovation, that it would give you animal spirits and so on. We're finding now that despite a few sort of extreme, shall we say, success stories, winner takes all kinds of success stories and deep concentration that results from that, and despite a few major innovations, technological changes, that in fact capitalism is not that dynamic anymore. Capitalism is not doing what it's supposed to do in its own terms, which is keep growing. And in fact, that the growth that it does do is at the cost of people, at the cost of societies, and at the cost of nature and the planet in unsustainable ways. So capitalism as a system is not really, shall we say, any more compatible with feasible survival on the planet or with democratic, pluralistic, and just societies.
There's a quote that's loosely attributed to John Maynard Keynes. In fact, I'm pretty sure he never said it. This is one of those things where, you come across so many quotes by Mahatma Gandhi on the internet, and I'm pretty sure he didn't say half of them, but someone said this quote, and some people think it's Keynes. Someone said, capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. And one of the solutions, or one of the proposed methods of solving some of the problems in capitalism, has been tax the rich, right? So I want to bring in a devil's advocate for the next question. I want to channel the words of Raghuram Rajan, former chief economist for the International Monetary Fund, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He's making a special appearance, a cameo for this next question, playing the role of the devil's advocate. He was asked in a recent interview whether taxing the rich can work, and he said, no, it won't work. It's not a feasible solution. He said that rich people will just find ways of circumventing a high wealth and inheritance tax. He even challenged the interviewer to name one country where it was implemented successfully. He said the only people it will actually hurt is the upper middle class, on whom you don't want to inflict more pain. The top 1% that you actually want to target will easily evade that higher tax. Do you think there's any merit to this argument?
So, there are different layers to this argument. Is taxation the solution? No, obviously it's not. It's not a single silver bullet. It's not going to solve the problems of capitalism, because the problems of capitalism are both what are called pre-distribution, how exactly incomes and assets get distributed in the first place, but also redistribution. Both exist. Is it fair to argue that taxing the rich will never work? No, it's historically ignorant, because in fact, all of the rich economies of today had very, very high levels of taxation in their own history at a period when they were doing rather well, thank you. In fact, even in terms of straightforward capitalist criteria. Take the US. The highest marginal rate for taxation was in excess of 90%. I think it was 93% at one point. Abigail Disney, who is a descendant of the famous Disney brothers, has a very interesting argument about this. She's basically saying that this period of very high taxation of the wealth or the incomes from wealth of the rich did not serve as a disincentive, because at that level of income, you really frankly cannot spend all of that money. Even if you take trips to the moon, as we have the rich people of today doing and so on, you can't spend all your money. You're constantly adding to it. So you don't really notice the absence of that. Yet if you like, the drive that is supposed to provide the incentive for innovation and invention and all of that, that doesn't disappear. So in a sense, the idea that, first of all, governments can't do it, that they'll find ways to evade it, that's not true, because it really is about the kind of regulation you have, the degree of, shall we say, insistence on ensuring that that regulation is enforced. So the political will to enforce that regulation, it can be done. It's absolutely wrong to say it can't be done. It is the absence of political will that puts in the loopholes, that allows the rich to evade it, move the money outside, do something else. It's actually very feasible. That's the first point. The second is that nobody is today talking about taxing the middle classes in terms of a wealth tax. The idea that is out there, the idea that is broadly getting a lot more affirmation, including by the G20 at their Brazil meeting last year, is one where you tax the extreme wealthy, okay, the super rich. So the super rich, Gabriel Zuckman defines it as the billionaires, the dollar billionaires. There are about 3,000 plus of them globally. But you don't have to necessarily do the dollar billionaires. You could do centimillionaires if you're a middle-income country. In India, that would already be, I think, about 180 families or maybe 280 families, something like that. Or you could tax slightly below that. In Colombia, they instituted a wealth tax for anybody holding more than $25 million because that's an extreme. That's like 0.0001% of the Colombian population. In India, for example, if we imposed a wealth tax on just the top 975 families who were in the Hurun richest list in, I think it was 2021, or no, 2020, but before, the pandemic had really struck. If we had imposed a 4% wealth tax on these very small, less than 1,000 families, we would have got 1% of GDP. Now, at that level of wealth, 4% is nothing. It could even be the equivalent of a stock market change. I mean, really, that much fluctuation is happening all the time. And you really cannot use that wealth. What you're really doing is putting most of that wealth into investments that further add to your wealth. As we've seen, the rich just keep getting richer, richer, richer the more we talk about this. So the ability to raise revenues is actually tremendous if you focus only on the super rich. And that does not affect the rest of society. It benefits the rest of society because it provides public resources that you could use for health, education, nutrition, sanitation, providing basic needs, improving the quality of life, improving public services, and so on.
I'll let him know. Let's pivot and talk about aid. This has been a hot topic recently with President Donald Trump's decision to shut down USAID. Once again, before we get into the problems, I think it would be helpful to just define the system, the game, and the players. So what is USAID? What is the IMF? And in an ideal world, what are they supposed to represent?
Again, a complex question that is going to get a complex answer.
Mm-hmm.
So, I grew up when I was your age, or actually when I was even younger than you. A big and important book around this topic was by Teresa Hayter. It was called Aid as Imperialism. And the USAID was a major player in that particular book. It was one of the important protagonists, an expression of US imperialism. So I come from a tradition that doesn't necessarily see aid the way it's often presented as this, benevolent do-gooding and so on. And we know that that is the case. We know that there are some, I'm not saying there's no aid that has any, that is directly designed, not that there's no aid that doesn't benefit people or is designed to benefit people and so on. But throughout the history of aid as we have known it, ever since the Second World War, it's been geopolitical in its orientation. So you find the donor countries disproportionately giving aid to allies, to those who are strategically important. And sometimes, in fact, it's been crucial. South Korea was a major beneficiary of aid per capita. And it was very much an integral part of the South Korean boom, which, also they got access to technology. They got a lot of access to markets, all the other things. But they also got very high per capita aid in the 1950s onwards. And it did play a big role. The European economies right after the Second World War got massive aid under the Marshall Plan from the US, geopolitical entirely in its orientation, and it did benefit them. But if you think of the bulk of the aid that has gone to the low and middle income countries, these days I even hesitate to call them developing because they're not all necessarily developing. But if you think of the aid that has gone to low and middle income countries, in very few cases can you find a situation where that aid has actually helped that economy to develop. And that has to do with the way the aid has been given. It's been given, as I said, for geopolitical reasons. It's been given for strategic reasons. It's been given according to the fads and flavors of the development industry at the time. Whatever they decide is the best silver bullet for poverty reduction, that gets a lot of money. And then that government and those people are forced to conform to that particular model of what works in development. It could be microfinance, it could be cash transfers, it could be whatever is the flavor of the month. But also, this aid often comes with very big strings. So a very large proportion of that actually goes back to the aid industry. It goes back to all the think tanks and consultants. In England, I remember, in fact, for the state of Andhra Pradesh, they had significant aid from the UK. And a lot of that aid was actually directed to the Adam Smith Institute in London, which was actively involved in pushing the Andhra Pradesh government in the 1990s to undertake very severe neoliberal policies that ended up undermining its own agricultural viability and the potential for industrialization in that state alone. But you will find many such instances in many other countries. It also, not only does a lot of it just go back to the donor country through all of this mechanism, but this also comes tied. A lot of the aid you have to use in terms of buying the machinery, the capital goods, the services of that country. So aid has always been problematic. And I think increasingly, I mean, of course, Trump withdrawing from USAID is a shock. And it's a shock because there was some USAID that was at the margin relatively small amounts, but it was in critical areas. So, for example, UNAIDS, which is still addressing the continuing issue of HIV/AIDS, which is prevalent in many, many countries, used to get 85% of its revenue from the US, and that's gone with USAID. It just disappeared. The World Food Program, which is supposed to direct food to some of the poorest and really starving people of the world, and particularly in conflict zones and so on, again, got money from USAID. It's gone. And so they are in deep distress. So WHO got a lot of money from the US, which some of it was a bit problematic because it also influenced a lot of WHO decision making. But nonetheless, that's also gone. Okay, so there are areas in which there's a deep crisis. But I think what this particular crisis has shown is that it is now a time to shift to a different model, not this whole, donor, recipient, very patron-client kind of way of looking at it, where, all these poor countries have to be very grateful for the largesse, which is really tiny crumbs, okay? And instead to a model of global public investment, which is a model that would, in fact, rely on every country giving money for what are seen as global public goods. And heavens, we have them now, right? We have them in public health. We have them because of climate change. We have them because so many of our problems do not respect national borders and passports and visas anymore, right? So we need global public investment to address all of these, particularly climate change mitigation adaptation, but also developmental problems, because otherwise we know they will lead to people's displacement, to conflict, and therefore to migration that also becomes a problem for the recipient countries. So we have to think of it in global public investment terms. Every country contributes whatever they can, and then that is distributed according to need. If you think of it that way, then it's no longer, this whole way of giving money, which is deeply patronizing and deeply unjust in a way, because most of it is not necessarily in the interests of the recipients.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's been a psychic challenge to decide how to feel about USAID. And you've quoted people from the school of thought. You've quoted the book Aid is Imperialism by Teresa Hayter. She's explained how foreign aid is used as a tool for economic and political control. There's a book, The Self-Deception Trap. Carlos Lopez talks about how European countries have used aid to establish dominance over countries in Africa. There's another book, The Washington Bullets by Vijay Prashad, where he actually quotes the Greek Minister of Finance, Yanis Varoufakis, who, when he was confronted by the European Union and the IMF during the debt crisis in Greece, he said, coups in the current period do not necessarily come through tanks. They often come through banks. And this has been a common tactic even in the US. Richard Nixon notoriously told Henry Kissinger to make the Chilean economy scream to prevent the rise of Salvador Allende. And along with coups by banks, Vijay Prashad has also pointed out the role of coups by NGOs. And he's used the example of Haiti and how the US has established NGOs all over the country to establish dominance. So I hear you. It's so tough to come to terms with aid being used as a facade or a mask for imperialism, but there's also obviously some positive externality that you have also pointed out. It's tough to come to terms with it. I want to zoom in on one aspect of the coups by banks. What causes these debt crises in the country? Is it true that a lot of the debt in these developing countries is actually engendered by these donor countries itself? Are those the reasons why these countries actually require aid in the first place?
So there is a fundamental structural imbalance for developing countries. That is, they're much more likely to have trade deficits and balance of payments deficits. Okay, they're industrializing. They need to import a whole range of goods. Even if they want to diversify their economies and start making those goods themselves, they will need to import machinery, they'll need to import intermediate goods, and they will not necessarily have enough exports to cover that. So there is a structural tendency to balance the payments deficits. It's something Keynes recognized as well, right? So when Keynes was planning for the global monetary system and financial system during the Bretton Woods era, what he wanted was a system whereby you would have a global currency, the Bancor. I suppose the SDR is a sort of half-hearted attempt to try and provide that. But the Bancor would be something just created by this institution, which he called the International Clearing Union. And it would issue these Bancors to every country according to a ratio of, let's say, the share of the global economy, the size of the population, etc., some formula. But developing countries would get double of that share because of that structural deficit, because of the fact that systemically they're much more likely to run balance of payments deficits. So they needed access to foreign exchange. Now, this is a painless way of distributing it. No rich country is getting affected, right? Because it's all money, just liquidity being created. That didn't work. That didn't fly, unfortunately. And so what we've got is a system where when countries enter into deficits, the IMF, which is supposed to provide short-term liquidity, and the World Bank, which is supposed to provide the longer-term financing for industrialization, for economic transformation, etc., have both failed. They have been inadequate, they have been slow, they have been conditional, they've insisted on all kinds of conditionalities that end up undoing any of the possible benefits of whatever little money may come in. And they have largely operated in the interests of global finance and large private capital globally. So the Bretton Woods institutions have really been a big disappointment. They have not lived up to their initial goals or even what is stated in their memorandum of agreement. They are really now, unfortunately, not delivering at all because they are largely serving the interests of the rich countries and global finance. It's not surprising because the way they were constructed, the US has got effective veto in both institutions. You need an 85% voting majority for most major decisions. And the US has got 16% votes. So just above that, you will never get there without the US, even if all the other countries in the world combine. But the US and Europe and Japan and Australia, etc., the rich countries together have got like 60% of voting rights. So there's no way developing countries would actually be able to get those institutions to deliver the way they were meant to. Effectively, the borrowers have no rights. So that's one problem, which is that the institutions that were set up in the middle of the 20th century to deal with this problem of inadequate finance reaching developing countries, they didn't do their job. As a result, private finance has become much more significant. Now, until fairly recently, until the period of globalization, developing countries, most of them didn't even have access to global private finance. They could not really get into private capital markets because they were seen as nobody wanted to lend to them. Everybody would buy US Treasury bills or lend to other agents in the rich countries or some of the middle income countries. Very little did they get access to credit. So, in fact, when they had balance of payments crisis, IMF, World Bank were the only things they could turn to. And then, with all of those attendant conditions and so on. What changed in the period of globalization, in fact, it wasn't really even in the period of globalization, but subsequently, is that you got a period of very easy interest rates. You got easy money policy in the US beginning in the 1990s. And then you got a dramatic expansion of liquidity in the 2000s, especially after the global financial crisis. So you're beginning with easier liquidity, and you're encouraging more and more developing countries to open up their financial markets, to enable domestic companies and governments to borrow more, saying, well, look, you can now borrow abroad. Earlier, capital markets wouldn't even let you in. Now they're willing to lend to you, so you must borrow. After 2008, the big financial crisis, you had massive monetary easing. You had the US, the European Central Bank, Japanese Central Bank, just throwing money out there, just absolutely flooding the world with liquidity and very, very low interest rates, right? Less than 1%, sometimes even in Japan and a few countries in Europe, even negative interest rates over some periods. And there's all this money now sloshing around the globe looking for a place to put it. So you had not just what are called emerging markets. Emerging markets are the countries, the developing countries that were earlier not seen as bankable, but now they are seen. So now they were integrated, right? And that happens in the 2000s. But by the 2010s, you've got the frontier markets. Now, the frontier markets are the ones that were seen as absolutely beyond the pale, zero access. Now, even they are getting access, okay? Now, remember, they're getting access, but there's still a risk premium. That is, they say, oh, well, we're lending to Zambia, or we're lending to Costa Rica, we're lending to some other country. It's going to be more expensive for them to borrow because they are not our top priority borrowers. Okay, they're not our AAA borrowers, if you like. So they did get access, but at much higher interest rates. And if anything happens, any shock happens, and the shock can be something that has nothing to do with your own country, then there would be a capital flight and the cost of borrowing would shoot up. And a lot of the lenders who had given money to you would suddenly stop lending. So we've had phases of these debt crises. We had the early 1980s and, the debt crisis, which really hit Latin America most, but there were other countries as well, South Korea and a few other African countries that were affected. That was not due to what the Latin Americans were doing. That was due to Reagan coming in, tightening money supply, raising interest rates. And so all the money flooded back to the US. So they were suddenly caught in the middle of their borrowing. You borrowed for something long term, but it's because of the fact that you're seen as high risk, etc., you're rolling over these loans at rates that are getting higher and higher. But then if the interest rate in the US has gone up, the capital's just gone back. And you don't anymore have that, the access to the funds you had when your investment is only half done. So even if you were doing something perfectly good and required with that money, suddenly you find you don't have it. So you have a debt crisis. So we've had the 1980s debt crisis. Then we had the Southeast Asian debt crisis in the 1990s, 97, 98. Similar pattern. Again, it was not something that happened that these countries did. What happened in Southeast Asia is that China emerges as a major exporter. How? In 1994, they devalue their currency, the renminbi, okay, quite significantly. And suddenly they're starting to export a lot of the things that Southeast Asians were exporting. And so these Southeast Asian countries that were showing export growth rates of 15%, 20%, I mean, crazy. Suddenly they're down to zero. Suddenly exports are flat. And so the capital, which had been put into these countries, and remember, for major financial institutions, it's a tiny amount. It's huge for the countries, but it's a tiny amount for them. So they just shift their portfolio. They say, let's move out of Thailand, let's move out of the Philippines, let's move out of Indonesia. And there's a big swing. So you have a big debt crisis there. Africa, similar. The mineral exporting countries, they would get money because they say, oh yeah, they've got iron ore, they've got cobalt, they've got copper, they've got whatever. Copper price falls, bam, they get a double whammy. Not only does their export price fall, but the money that was coming into them stops. So that's why you have these periodic waves of debt crisis in developing countries. What's made it particularly worse in the current situation is that, earlier you would borrow from, let's say, there would be some public borrowing, and there would be some multilateral borrowing, and there would be borrowing from, let's say, banks, in terms of basic loans. Increasingly, from the mid to 2010s, we've had bond markets developing for all of these countries. And this was encouraged by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the Davos people in the World Economic Forum. Countries were told, of course, you must have your own bond markets. Of course, you must issue bonds because you're going to get access to all of this money. And they were actually encouraged to get sovereign bonds. The governments were encouraged to issue debt abroad for their own fiscal deficits, which, when you think about it, is a very stupid thing for an IMF that is supposedly concerned with balance of payment stabilization to be advocating. But they actively did that. And so you find that many, many countries were attracted to this because really low interest rates, right? I mean, crazy low interest rates, well below the rate of inflation. So negative rates in real terms. And access to money of a kind that you simply didn't have before. So some countries used it and took it and used it badly. The Rajapakshas in Sri Lanka, for example, they had vanity projects, they had corruption, they had the works, okay? They took it and misused it. But you have countries like Zambia that were trying to invest in infrastructure, that were trying to do good things to diversify their economy. But they also get caught in this simply because you've taken all these loans and you're anticipating that you'll continue to be getting these loans for a reasonable amount of time until you finish at least that investment. But meanwhile, first COVID happens, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the Ukraine war happens, and inflation comes along with that, and then the US and EU decide to raise interest rates. So again, multiple whammy. Your export earnings fall, your other foreign exchange earnings fall, and you stop getting the capital flows. And the interest rates on your debt go up. So it's not surprising that so many countries ended up in extreme debt difficulty. 72 countries were in severe debt stress. About 11 of them were in default. It's a little lower now, but that's not because the problem has got easier. It's because they have managed to squeeze out that payment, those debt repayments, by squeezing their own populations, by denying them consumption, denying them basic public services, and so on. So there is a deep sense in which the workings of the international financial system and the fact that there is this currency hierarchy are really deeply against the interests of developing countries. And I would argue that for many of these countries, you should minimize your external debt dependence. You should not be saying, oh, the interest rates are cheaper, I will just borrow abroad. You should only borrow for the things that you desperately need the foreign exchange for. And everywhere else, you actually try and use other methods, and you use domestic resources. You raise tax revenues, including through a wealth tax. You wait for, or you use domestic borrowing, which is actually at least in your own currency, so you're not stuck, in a way that you have to go to the IMF.
It's definitely such a complex issue and the machinery is complicated. So I'm really glad we have you to be able to break it down and shed some light. So while I have you here, I would also want to request you to shed some light on another complex, complicated issue. Let's pivot and talk about demonetization in India in 2016. In your book, Demonetization Decoded, you say that the shock announcement of Prime Minister Modi on 8th November, which he described as a movement for purifying a country, had the explicit aims of dealing with the problem of terrorism and the challenge posed by corruption and black money. Obviously, these goals are laudable in themselves, and very few people would oppose them. The debate really hinges on the best means to achieve these goals in a way that does not cause damage to innocent people and the society at large. So first, once again, let's just start by describing the event. What was demonetization in 2016? What was it supposed to do? And what actually happened?
Yeah, this is, in fact, I think it's possibly a unique experiment globally, because there have been cases where governments have said, okay, so-and-so currency is no longer going to be legally valid, but they have done that over a phased manner. They'll say, in Europe, they said the 500 euro note is no longer legally valid, but they've done that in a phased manner. In 3 months, 6 months, you go in, and they have exchanged that note at the banks for equivalent new notes that are still legally valid, okay? So countries have done that in the past. This was an entirely different thing, where you suddenly went and said, the following notes are not valid: the 500 rupee note and the 1,000 rupee note, which are the large denomination notes in India. And they're not going to be valid from 4 hours from now. So he comes on television at 8 p.m. at night and says, from midnight, these notes will not be valid. Now, at that time, these notes accounted for 86% of the currency in circulation. 86%. Can you imagine? So you're basically saying, I'm taking all the currency out of the market. And India at that time was a fully cash dependent economy. It was about, I mean, we have different estimates, but around 95% of transactions were in cash, especially because we have a very large informal sector. So what you're really doing, you're really just stopping the blood circulation of a system. You're just saying, bam, that's it. No activity. Your money is worthless. So you can imagine the confusion, the chaos, the tragedies that emerged as a result. Because the next day, you can't do anything with the money you already have. You cannot buy petrol. You cannot go to a hospital and get treated. You cannot travel buy a ticket for travel. You cannot pay your workers with money that is now worthless. They thought, mistakenly, of course, they thought that corruption is only expressed in cash. And the extent of cash is an indicator of the extent of corruption. Now, both are completely false ideas. Okay, some of the most developed rich economies actually have very high proportions of cash. Japan, for example, I think it's still 85% cash economy. Okay, some others, even Germany, a lot of European countries use a lot of cash. So that's one angle, that it's certainly not the case that all cash is corrupt. Okay, it has different kinds of convenience. But the other point is that corruption today is not about cash at all, except in the very small things where, you're paying off the local constable, or you're trying to get out of a parking fee or something, you hand over some money. That if you leave the low-level corruption aside, most corruption, most illicit flows today are digital. And that's so evident across the world. That is, you have to do a completely different set of things to address that. Then there was the idea that this is how terrorists fund, through cash, that they are hiring kids to throw stones and so on, and they're giving them 500 rupee notes. So if you remove the 500 rupee notes, they won't be able to throw stones. I mean, seriously, that was actually the argument, as if something like terrorism can be, resolved in this really simplistic and ridiculous manner. So, in fact, it was remarkable in that it did not meet a single one of the objectives that was stated. And when that became evident after a few months, then they changed the goalposts. Then they said, oh, well, actually, we wanted to digitize the economy. And this is one way of forcing digitization. But in fact, digital payments, online payments was already occurring. In fact, it would have happened anyway, because it's, in many cases, it's more convenient. And we had, the growth of digital apps, mobile phones, etc., that enabled much more digital transaction anyway. However, what did it do? So it didn't meet any of the goals that it was supposedly designed for. What did it actually do? It destroyed the informal economy. It put so much pressure. Suddenly, you have an informal economy that runs on cash, and there is nothing that you can do with that. The cash you have, you cannot use, because they were trying to be secretive about it. They hadn't even told, I'm told even the finance minister was involved only that day. The RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, which is supposed to make that decision, was told to have a special meeting and made to take that decision that afternoon. As a result, nobody was prepared. The mints were unprepared. The state governments were unprepared. Everybody was unprepared. And so you had almost a breakdown of certainly the informal economy. The privileged people, including myself, who can operate on credit cards and mobiles and etc., we were okay. But the entire Indian economy, the informal sector that employs 85% of the people, and all of the others in the formal sector who also used to receive cash payments for daily wages and so on, suddenly there's no money. So the mints were only able to start replacing money several months later. There was such a shortage of basic cash to meet any of these needs. It took a full year for the system to generate the same amount of cash notes that they had before in terms of the value. And mind you, after that, by the way, the cash in circulation has kept increasing as well. So it's not the case that they got rid of the idea of using cash. There is more cash in circulation today than there was when there was demonetization. Okay? Because you destroyed the informal sector, it's not enough that immediately there were people who couldn't be paid, people who couldn't get basic necessities, people who couldn't get health care. All of that happened, of course. There were so many tragedies. But in addition to that, and people dying in queues waiting to collect money, people dying because they didn't get hospital access, terrible tragedies occurred. But also, this had a terrible negative multiplier effect. You reduce economic activity like this for a month, 2 months, and in some cases 3 months. Obviously, the people who would have earned, they're not earning, they stop spending. So you get negative multipliers. You get less and less and less ability to spend. And so instead of generating growth, you actually generated a steep decline from the kind of economy you would have had if you hadn't had demonetization. So it was a huge mistake. There is absolutely nothing that was right about it. But it was very much part of a strategy of governing, a shock and awe approach to governing, where you come with this big announcement and show how powerful you are and show how everybody is going to just have to respond to what you do. And you don't really care about the consequences. You're doing that to establish power. Something that Mr. Trump is also pretty good at, and definitely using that playbook of shock and awe tactics without much regard for the consequences. There was one other consequence, which is a purely political one, which is that what this also did is decimate the coffers of the opposition parties before a very important state election in India, in Uttar Pradesh, the most populous state. And we are told, and we have some indications, that some of the ruling party had prior information and they were able to shift out of the kind of cash holdings that they had. Whereas none of the opposition parties obviously had any idea. So they were completely decimated. And of course, this is a very important part of spending. Electoral spending, you probably know, is a very major element in determining results as well. And so definitely the ruling party benefited from this and did, in fact, win those important elections in Uttar Pradesh the next year.
You've said in your book that the stated goals were laudable, and we've already established the execution was shoddy. We didn't meet any of the goals. And there's also maybe a nefarious tactic of decimating the coffers of the opposition as well. But as a whole, do you think the intent was right, even if the execution was terrible? Was this a policy that was launched with good intentions, or do you think the intention was malicious as well?
I can't speak for the intention, but I can tell you that conceptually it doesn't make sense. As I said, this does not get rid of corruption. This does not get rid of terrorism. This does not do the things that you say it will do. So this way of doing demonetization could never have achieved its goals. It's true, it was done so badly that it did a lot more damage than it needed to have. But it could not have worked in terms of those goals in any case, because that's the wrong way to approach those problems.
There's a quote by Lord Acton, which goes, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and or authority. Still more when you add the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority." Do you think leaders get into positions of power with good intentions at heart, but it's the nature of power and authority that ends up corrupting them? And if that is the case, it's not an answer I like, but it at least helps me sleep at night. It keeps me sane. It helps me understand the type of decisions made by someone like Barack Obama or Joe Biden, even as recent as enabling the genocide in Palestine as well. I can explain it away as they did it in interest of national security, or they wanted to keep their allies happy. They want to keep money in politics. It's not an answer I like at all, but I can explain that away. Do you think it's power itself that forces their hands and it makes these good people do bad things? Or do you think only bad people make it to the top in politics and all these position of power do is amplify their bad traits?
That's a tough one. I agree. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. power does corrupt to some point, but it's not always corrupting. I don't think that every single global leader we have ever had has got corrupted. I don't agree with that position. And do I think, for example, that Modi's demonetization was just because of power? No, I think it was part of a broader tendency we have seen in him: shock and awe, and control through shock and awe. I think it's the same is true of President Trump. I mean, it's not that everybody's the same. It's not that it doesn't matter whom you elect and that they're all going to end up the same way. Mr. Biden was always pro-Israel. Even as a senator, he was shocking in terms of the extent to which he was willing to support Israel, including in attacking innocent people in Gaza and in the West Bank and so on. So it's not the case that all leaders are all the same. If I did think that, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, actually. I don't think that's the case. I think, in fact, it is possible to find leaders who will be more responsive. And I think the aim of all our societies is to somehow try and get to a situation where leaders are forced to be more accountable and more responsive. We have generated too many of these strong men who feel that the show of power is enough and that they are not necessarily open to questioning or any degree of accountability.
To close the loop on demonetization and the goals and the execution of it, I want to create a report card for the Modi government. So, can you steelman the case for the Modi government? Is there anything they have done right in the entire tenure? Are there any positives from the government?
Let me see. The trouble is that I am so I'm so unhappy, first of all, with economic mismanagement for sure. There's definitely a lot of economic mismanagement, but also with the very deeply centralizing forces that they have created. The anti-federal approach, which I think is dangerous for a country like India. We can't afford it. We really have to stay federal if we have to stay one country. Okay, so those, as in purely economic terms, I find the list of both omissions and commissions very, very large. Okay, so I am deeply concerned about the lack of employment generation and the lack of any focus on employment generation, the lack of any realism about what is required to do generate much more productive employment, especially for our young people who are now the big demographic bulge. I am deeply concerned by the atmosphere of hate and the open polarization and the anti-minority, specifically anti-Muslim, but also anti-Christian, but anti-minority approach in general. I'm offended by the blatantly patriarchal behavior of not just the prime minister, but the ministry, the ministers, the people that encourage the ecosystem, the broader Sangh ecosystem, which is both aggressively patriarchal and aggressively communal, and in all kinds of very, very unpleasant ways. So on all of these spheres, I think really it's hard to find anything good in that sense. The thing they're really good at is managing public perception, is PR. I think it's extraordinary how good they are at that, and that requires a degree of political savvy and ingenuity and an ability to relate to and reach people, which is very difficult and which they clearly have. They clearly are able to persuade people of a narrative, even when it's so completely different from the lived experience of most of the people that they're speaking to. And they have been able to create that narrative globally as well, which again is fascinating. That globally you will find even among progressives, you will find people telling you, oh, how, digitization in India has been this terrific success because of your unique identity, the Aadhaar card. And you're trying to tell them, listen, the biometrics is the worst thing you can do for a country like India with so many manual laborer who don't actually have matching biometrics over time and who therefore lose out on their entitlements and even on their wages. That it's also something that is so prone to monitoring and surveillance and control that you have to be concerned about that. But the ability of them to be able to present a completely different narrative is quite remarkable. It requires a lot of effort. It doesn't happen easily. And as I said, first of all, you have to have that political intelligence that can do it. But you also need very systematic efforts. You have to destroy the entire data system of the country. You have to go after every international institution that says anything negative about you. If you're low in the food index, you go over there and fight and argue and da-da-da. You get the World Bank to agree to completely nonsensical poverty estimates that you generate, so that apparently now we have less than 4% poor people in India. You really work hard for all of these management of public perception, both inside and globally. And that they are really very good at.
I've got a very imbalanced report card here. So I've got A+ for PR and perception management, and seems like F for everything else. So it's not looking promising. I hope they're listening. Before we wrap up, I also want to quickly get your thoughts on some feminist economics. In your book, Informal Women Workers in the Global South, you talk about the hidden role that women play in what Marxists called social reproduction, right? Work that keeps society alive and sustains it. So largely care work, household chores, raising children. Let's define the problem statement. What are these hidden roles that women are playing in society? What are these hidden variables that are not being accounted for in employment metrics?
So this is really, if you like, the essence of feminist economics. The essence is the recognition that there is in every society a division of labor that is largely gendered, depends on whether you're a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, in which this entire job of care, and care defined broadly, looking after the young, the old, the sick, the differently abled, and the ones who decide that they need to be looked after, even if they can do it themselves, looking after, but also all the other things you mentioned, that keep the existence going, cooking, cleaning, provisioning, making sure that there's water, there's fuel, there's food, there's all of those things. These are all activities that have to be done. Families wouldn't exist without them. Societies wouldn't exist without them. Economies wouldn't exist without them. But when they are not done as paid work, which is most of the time, especially in low and middle income countries like ours, then they're not called work, or rather they're not considered as employment. So all of the activities that are performed, they are fundamentally economic activities, but they're not recognized as such because they are not transacted. And because of that lack of transaction, there are many, many implications. So the first implication is that not only do you undervalue or completely devalue the work that is done, it is also then socially undervalued and devalued, because society increasingly values only the monetary benefits that you gain from work. Then the women who are doing this, not only do they have to spend an inordinate amount of time doing this unpaid work, but when they do enter a labor market, when they do try and seek employment, they tend to be clustered in low-paid occupations, typically reproducing those same social roles, nursing, domestic work, etc., etc. And those, in a sense, it's because society says, well, you can get this unpaid, so why do you need to pay very much for it anyway? So you will find the greater the amount of unpaid work and the greater the proportion of women doing unpaid work in a society, the greater the gender wage gap. In India, we have very, very high proportions of unpaid workers and time spent in unpaid work. By global standards, we're very high. And we have a very high gender wage gap. On average, women get about 60% of the wages of men, on average. And you can imagine the gap is very high once you actually get into other specific occupations. Women get clustered into the low-wage occupations. And then, of course, even if a man does it, then there's a wage penalty on the man as well. If a man is a nurse, they're also low-paid. If a man is an attendant, they're also low-paid, and so on. But the other thing is that this is actually a huge subsidy on the recognized economy, on the formal economy that we call it, okay? Because by not recognizing it, you are benefiting from it without having to, admit that you should actually be somewhere accounting for it and recognizing your debt to that economy. So it's like this formal economy is a ship sailing on this huge sea of unpaid work. And it doesn't actually have to look down and see what's on that sea. It's just floating along on it, traveling on it in this very easy way. However, it also means that both private employers and governments can utilize this fact that there is this unpaid work because of a very important feature of this unpaid work, of care work in general, which is that people care about those whom they care for. So you will continue caring, even if you're, it's not something you will stop doing, because let's say, supposing you used to have creches for children and now you stop having those creches. And so the children, are they not going to be looked after? No, somebody will look after them. They're not going to be left on the street at that time, simply because, there is no creche. If you remove elderly care, if you do not provide opportunities for the old to be looked after, etc., does it mean that people will put their aged mother out on the road and say, okay, now that's it, I'm not going to look after them? No. All of this will continue, right? And it will continue in unpaid fashion. Now, governments actually use this. They use this because that's why in periods of downswing, in periods of fiscal stress, austerity, these are the things that are easy to cut. Across the world, not just in India, across the world, they're easy to cut because that work is going to get done anyway. And so it's, earlier feminists, we used to talk about gender blind economic policies. I no longer think they're gender blind. They are gender exploitative. They are governments and employers exploiting this fact that this work is going to get done anyway. So you can get away with not making any monetary provision for it.
So if you had a magic wand, how do you solve this problem? Is recognition the biggest step towards solving the problem?
Well, feminist economists have thought about this a lot, and we basically argue that there are 5 R's that are essential. So yes, the first one is to recognize, absolutely. Okay. Mm-hmm. And how do you recognize? You track, you do time use surveys, you follow men and women around, ideally, or you at least get them to have time diaries so that you figure out how much time they're spending every day, every week on different activities. And that's being done. There are 94 countries, I think, now that have done recent time use surveys. But it's something every country should be doing annually, really, to be checking, okay, what policies make the unpaid labor time go up? What makes leisure time or relational time improve? So that's number one, recognize. But the second, very important, reduce. Reduce some of the work that is not necessary. Don't force women to walk for hours collecting fuel wood or fetching water. That is, go in for infrastructure and amenities that will provide these to households without forcing women and girls to be doing all of that stuff. And that's a whole range of things. That also includes a range of, let's say, household drudgery reducing gadgets, whether these are washing machines or, grinding machines for spices in India or all kinds of things like that. So reduce is the second. The third is to actually redistribute. So we shouldn't say that this is the job of the family or the household. It has to be redistributed between families, the public sector, that is governments and other public institutions, the private sector, and cooperatives. We have to have a care diamond in which these different activities are distributed. It shouldn't be the job of only women at home for early childhood development. In fact, ideally, early childhood pedagogy is a very developed and it's a skilled activity. People have to be trained in it. So we should be distributing a lot of this work in many, among the care diamond that I talked about. And fourthly, we must reward, in fact, the workers who are doing this paid work, the care work in a paid fashion. Because we undervalue the unpaid workers, we also undervalue and underpay the care workers. In India, we have ASHAs, that is accredited social health activists. We have Anganwadi workers who work in creches, who don't even get a minimum wage. They're not considered workers. They're called volunteers so that they can get an honorarium, which is like a third of the minimum wage or even less in some states. So we must reward care workers and recognize it as a skilled activity and an essential activity. Okay? And finally, represent, the fifth R. The workers themselves must have a voice. Both the paid and the unpaid workers have to be represented in policy. They must have a voice in all of the decisions that affect their lives.
Yeah, the 5 R's, easy to remember. Thank you for sharing that. Professor, you've been sharing so many powerful ideas. Every time you share something, I have 10 more questions, so we could keep doing this for hours, but I do want to be respectful of your time. So let's start wrapping up. Final 3 questions, rapid fire. as we wrap up, what are some books, movies, role models that have strongly influenced you in your life?
It's, well, in terms of non-fiction books, I would say, as an economist, the books of Amir Bagchi, Prabhat Patnaik, Joan Robinson, Kaleski, these are really, some of my heroes in terms of economics writing, both for their profundity and their lucidity. In terms of fiction, actually, my favorite book for a very, very long time was Proust. In Remembrance of Things Past is the official English title, but it's the French term is In Search of Lost Time. And it's 6 volumes. It's a long read, but it's absolutely fascinating because it's a tremendous, both inward and outward looking kind of comment on society. And I find it resonates with so many things and so many people around and so many different ways in which I see people and societies playing out in different ways.
What would you like your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered?
I would love to be remembered as somebody who, I mean, I don't know if I've been able to make any difference, but if I have been able to make even a little bit of difference in people's lives, I mean, I'm a teacher. If I have got a student who has got interested in something because of me, even if they've rejected my ideas after that, but they just got interested in it. If I've awakened something that has taken them forward in a particular way, that I think I would value greatly. Yeah.
I think you're already doing that. Final question. What is the meaning of life, Professor Jayati Ghosh?
I'm not religious, okay? So let me establish this, that I don't have the joy, the security, and the satisfaction of believing in an afterlife or that there is a broader purpose to all of these things. I think not being religious is a very unfortunate thing, actually, because you don't have that to sort of, hang on to. I am, however, I like to think that I do believe in a spiritual life, okay? So what is the meaning of life? I think the meaning of life is to find joy, and specifically to find joy in community. And that in turn means that you have to recognize and care about communities, but not communities in a very narrow sense in which you have to other people who are not in your community. So I think for me, the meaning of life would be to find satisfaction and joy in a wider social group.
Finding joy and satisfaction in a wider social group. I can always get behind that meaning. Professor, if people wish to connect with you, find out more about you or your work, or read some of your books, what is the best way to find you or your work?
Oh, wow, this is tough. So, there is, I have email and all of that kind of thing, but there is an organization I've been associated with now for more than 3 decades. No, 2.5 decades, called IDEAS, International Development Economics Associates. The website address, it's www.networkideas.org. It's a network of development economists, largely based in the global south, that wants to look at the whole process of development through a different lens and through what we hope is a more progressive but heterodox lens. And I have a blog in that. That is to say, a lot of the stuff I write in other places also gets reproduced in that blog.
That is a place to find you. Professor, thank you so much for such a fantastic conversation. It was truly a privilege for me.
Thank you.